They called her a rookie. They handed her the worst shifts, the most difficult patients, and zero respect. Dr. Marcus Thorne looked her in the eye and said, "You're a nurse, Carter. Stay in your lane." She smiled and said nothing. She always said nothing. But when a critically wounded man was wheeled through the emergency doors, a man she'd once pulled out of a burning vehicle under enemy fire, she stepped forward and stopped an entire trauma team cold. And that's when the black helicopter landed on the hospital lawn, and the soldiers inside asked for her by a name nobody in that building had ever heard. Before this story goes any further, if you've never been here before, hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel is where the stories nobody tells out loud finally get told. Every single week, we bring you narratives that will keep you up at night. Stories of people who were counted out, pushed down, and written off, and then came back in ways that nobody saw coming. Hit the like button if you're already feeling it, and drop a comment below with your city and country. I want to see exactly how far this story travels before it's done. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The thing about Harlow County General was that it smelled like burnt coffee and floor wax, no matter what time of day you walked through the doors. It was a smell that clung to your clothes and followed you home, and after a while, the nurses stopped noticing it. They stopped noticing a lot of things, actually. That was the nature of survival in a place like that. You learned what to pay attention to and what to let slide, and the things you let slide tended to pile up in corners where nobody looked. Nora Callaway noticed everything. She noticed the way the third-floor supply closet was always unlocked after 10 p.m., even though policy required it sealed. She noticed that Dr. Marcus Thorne always arrived exactly 40 minutes before rounds, but his patient notes were often time-stamped from the night before. She noticed the private surgical suite on the East Wing, Suite 14, that was supposedly reserved for administrative overflow, but had been occupied every Tuesday and Thursday for the past 2 months by a team she didn't recognize. She noticed these things and said nothing, because she was new, and being new at Harlow County General meant understanding your position in the food chain very quickly. The food chain was not complicated. At the top sat Dr. Marcus Thorne, Chief of Trauma Surgery, a man who had the build of someone who had once played college football and the temperament of someone who deeply missed it. He was not cruel, exactly. Cruel would have implied he thought about the people beneath him. He simply didn't. Nurses were a category to him, not individuals. A necessary function of the hospital ecosystem, like supply carts and sanitizing wipes, useful when properly operated and invisible the rest of the time. Below Thorne sat a loose hierarchy of attending physicians, residents who were perpetually exhausted and slightly dangerous because of it, charge nurses who had learned to navigate the politics with the precision of diplomats, and then, at the very bottom, the newer staff. The people still learning where the supply closets were. The people who got the worst shifts, the heaviest patient loads, and the kind of condescension that came wrapped in a smile so that it couldn't technically be called condescension. Nora had been at the bottom for 4 months. She didn't complain about it. She showed up early, stayed late, kept her documentation meticulous, and studied the floor with the same focused attention she had once used to memorize terrain maps and threat assessments. Because that's what you did when you were new to an environment. You watched, you learned, you identified the systems at work and the people who controlled them. She had learned to do this in a different kind of environment, one that most people in this building would not have recognized as connected to hospital work at all. 6 years as a special operations combat medic had a way of training your eye for patterns, for things that didn't fit, for the small details that looked routine until you understood what they meant. She had left that world deliberately. She wasn't running from it. She was clear about that distinction in her own mind, even when the line between the two felt thin. She had left because she needed something quieter, something where the stakes felt manageable and the casualties could be counted in recoveries instead of losses. She had come to Harlow County General because she wanted to be ordinary. Ordinary was not cooperating. It started on a Tuesday, 3 weeks before everything broke open. Nora was on overnight, which she usually was. Overnight shifts were the punishment assignments, the ones handed to people who hadn't yet earned enough seniority to avoid them, and she received them without argument. The floor was quiet past midnight, the kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful so much as held, like a breath before something happened. She was updating medication logs at the nursing station when she noticed the chart discrepancy. Room 318. A 61-year-old man named Gerald Austin admitted for complications from a routine cardiac procedure. His intake chart listed his medication regimen one way: His updated chart, filed that afternoon, listed it differently. Not dramatically differently. The change was subtle, the kind of alteration that a busy nurse doing a quick check might miss entirely. But Nora wasn't doing a quick check. She read charts the way she had once read mission briefs, with the understanding that the detail you skimmed was the one that got you killed. She cross-referenced Austein's chart against his pharmacy records. The medications matched the updated version, not the intake version, which meant someone had changed the chart to match what was already being administered, rather than administering what the chart said. That was backwards. That was wrong. She flagged it internally and went to check on Austein directly. He was asleep, vitals steady, nothing immediately alarming. She spent a few minutes with him, documented what she observed, and returned to the station. Then she pulled 2 other charts. Not because she had any particular reason to. She told herself it was just thoroughness, the habit of someone who checked twice. She pulled the chart for room 412, a 53-year-old woman named Delia Park, admitted the week before for a respiratory issue that hadn't responded to standard treatment. And room 207, a 70-year-old man named Arthur Bendel, who had been at Harlow for nearly a month with a diagnosis that seemed to keep shifting slightly each time she reviewed his file. She sat with those 3 charts for 40 minutes. By the end of those 40 minutes, her coffee was cold, and her hands were very still on the desk. All 3 patients had something in common, beyond their altered records, beyond the subtle medication discrepancies. All 3 had been seen, at some point in their recent treatment history, by the same consulting team. A group listed in the system simply as the Whitmore Clinical Partnership, with no individual physician names attached. Just a group identifier, an extension number, and a notation that their services had been engaged through the hospital's administrative office. Nora wrote the name down on a piece of paper and put it in her pocket. Then she went back to work and finished her shift without saying a word to anyone. That was the beginning. Over the following week, she moved carefully. She was not reckless. Recklessness was a failure of discipline, and whatever else had changed about her life since leaving the service, her discipline had not softened. She accessed only records she had legitimate clinical reason to access, and she took nothing physical. She memorized. She cross-referenced. She kept her own notes in a small-lined notebook she bought at a drugstore 3 blocks from her apartment, paying cash. What she found, piece by piece, was worse than a medication error. The Whitmore Clinical Partnership was not listed anywhere on the hospital's publicly accessible vendor records. It did not appear in the administrative directory. When she asked a charge nurse about it, casually, in passing, framing it as confusion about a patient's billing code, the charge nurse looked at her for a second too long before saying she wasn't familiar with it, and suggesting Nora take the question to the administrative office during business hours. Nora did not take the question to the administrative office. Instead, she started watching Suite 14. The private surgical suite was accessed from a corridor off the east wing that required a different keycard level than her current clearance. She couldn't enter, but she could observe the corridor from a supply room whose door lock was faulty, the kind of fault that got reported and then never fixed, which meant either the maintenance request had been buried or someone found the faulty lock convenient. On a Thursday, 11 days after she found the first chart discrepancy, she watched a gurney being wheeled into Suite 14 at 11:47 p.m. The patient on it was conscious, she thought. She caught a brief glimpse of a hand shifting before the doors closed. There were 4 people with the gurney. None of them were staff she recognized. They were not wearing Harlow County General ID badges. She stayed in the supply room for another 20 minutes after the corridor was empty, running through what she knew and what it implied. The implications were not good. They were, in fact, the kind of implications that required a decision about what she was going to do next. She could report what she'd observed to the hospital's compliance office. She had considered this. She had also considered that the compliance office was run by a man named Director Wallace Pruitt, who had been at Harlow for 17 years, whose office was on the same floor as the administrative suite that had engaged the Whitmore Clinical Partnership, and who had personally approved the use of Suite 14 for administrative overflow, according to the facility's records she had found in a quarterly report buried in the hospital's internal document system. Reporting to Pruitt would be the same as reporting to the people she was reporting about. Federal channels were an option. She knew how to reach them, knew the procedures, but she had nothing yet that would survive scrutiny. A chart discrepancy. A mysterious consulting group. A gurney moved after midnight. She needed more, and she was aware that the window for getting more was not indefinite. Because on the day she made that decision, standing in a dark supply room off an East Wing corridor, she became aware of something else. She was being watched. Not obviously, not clumsily. Whoever was doing it was competent enough that she wouldn't have noticed if she hadn't been trained to. But there was a maintenance worker who had appeared on her floor twice in 3 days for repairs that didn't seem to correspond to any work orders she'd seen posted, and her locker had been accessed. The combination dial sat at a slightly different angle than she left it. A small thing, the kind of thing you'd have to be obsessive about your own habits to catch. Someone was checking on her. That meant someone had noticed her noticing. She accelerated her timeline. In the 3 days that followed, she moved faster than was comfortable. She accessed 7 more patient files, all connected by patterns she was now able to identify quickly. The Whitmore consultations, the altered records, the treatment protocols that didn't match standard care for the diagnosed conditions. She recorded everything she could from the files in the notebook. She documented the timestamps of her access to ensure she couldn't be accused of anything outside normal nursing duties. And then she found the intake log. It was a document she stumbled across almost by accident, a scheduling record for Suite 14 that someone had misfiled in the general surgical schedule rather than whatever secured location it was supposed to live in. It was a list of upcoming procedures, time-stamped for the next 6 weeks, with patient identifiers in a coding system she didn't immediately recognize. She photographed it with her phone, a risk she had been avoiding until now, and then filed it back where she'd found it. She was standing at a nursing station reviewing a patient's post-operative notes at 6:43 in the morning when Dr. Thorne appeared at her shoulder. She hadn't heard him approach. He stood close enough that it was clearly intentional, the kind of spatial intrusion designed to remind you of the power differential. "Carter," he said. "Dr. Thorne." She didn't look up from the chart. "You were in the East Corridor last Thursday. Late." It wasn't a question. She set the chart down and looked at him. His expression was professionally neutral, the kind of neutral that took effort. "Supply run," she said. "We were low on the overnight kit stock." At 11:30. "Patients don't schedule their needs around business hours." Something shifted in his face. Not anger exactly, more like a recalibration. He looked at her for a moment longer than the conversation required. "You're on probationary status," he said finally. "First-year nurses at this facility operate under close review. You should be focused on your patient responsibilities, not wandering corridors outside your department." "I understand," she said. He walked away. She watched him go and then turned back to the chart and finished her notes, her handwriting precise and unchanged. She had approximately 72 hours before something happened. She didn't know exactly what: dismissal, a formal complaint, something more direct. But the conversation with Thorne had the texture of a warning, and warnings were only given when someone had already decided what came after them. She had 2 nights left on her current rotation. She used them. On the first night, she accessed the hospital's internal billing system through a terminal in the records room, using the login credentials of a physician she was assisting that evening. Not stolen, he had handed her his access card to pull a file and not asked for it back for several minutes, which was long enough. She found billing records for the Whitmore Clinical Partnership that didn't appear anywhere in the external-facing documentation. They were enormous. Hundreds of thousands of dollars billed to insurance providers over 18 months for procedures listed under vague categorical codes that didn't correspond to specific treatments in any way she could trace. The money was real. The treatments, she was beginning to believe, were something other than what they were coded as. On the second night, she found the list. Not the scheduling list she had photographed, something else. A separate document, internal, accessed through a shared drive folder that was technically accessible to nursing staff for patient coordination purposes, but had clearly been used for something it was never intended for. A subfolder nested inside a folder, nested inside another folder, the kind of structure designed not for security so much as obscurity. Inside it was a list of names, 31 names, some she recognized from the patient records she had already reviewed. Others she didn't. At the bottom of the list, added within the past 48 hours, she could see the modification timestamp, was a name that stopped her cold. She read it twice. Staff Sergeant Daniel Merritt, incoming transfer, Harlow County General, trauma admission, military facility routing, classified injury status. Daniel Merritt had been in her unit. He had been at 3 of the same forward operating bases. She had treated him once for a shrapnel wound that should have killed him and didn't, and afterward he had looked at her with the specific expression of someone recalibrating their understanding of what was possible. He was being routed to this hospital, to this floor, into the cares of the same system that had been altering records and running unauthorized procedures on patients who didn't know what was being done to them. She closed the folder, logged out of the terminal, and sat very still for a moment. Then she stood, straightened her scrubs, and went back to the floor. The next morning, Director Pruitt himself appeared at the nursing station while she was coming off shift. He was with 2 members of the hospital security team. His expression was the specific kind of pleasant that people wear when they're about to do something they've already decided is justified. "Ms. Callaway," he said, "we need to speak with you." They walked her to a small conference room she'd never been in. The hospital's legal representative was already there, a woman with reading glasses and a closed laptop, and the general bearing of someone who had done this before. Pruitt placed a printed report on the table. "It has come to our attention," he said, "that you accessed restricted patient records outside the scope of your clinical responsibilities. Additionally, you were observed in a restricted area of the facility after hours without authorization." Nora looked at the report. It was thorough. It named the records she'd accessed, the terminal she'd used, the corridor where she'd been observed. Someone had been tracking her more closely than she'd realized, which meant her window had been even shorter than she thought. "I'd like to review these allegations carefully before responding," she said. "Of course," Pruitt said. "In the meantime, your access credentials have been suspended. You'll surrender your badge to security, and you're not to enter any patient care area until this matter is resolved." He paused. "I want to be clear that we take this seriously. Patient confidentiality is the foundation of this institution." The word foundation landed with a particular weight, given what she knew about the institution's actual foundations. She surrendered her badge. She was walked to her locker, allowed to collect her personal items under observation, and then escorted to the main entrance. The security officer who walked her out, a younger man, probably new, uncomfortable with the assignment, avoided meeting her eyes. Outside, the morning was cold and gray, the parking lot mostly empty this early. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, the strap of her bag over one shoulder, and took a breath. She had the notebook. She had the photograph on her phone of the scheduling document. She had everything she had memorized, which was more than what was in either of those things. And she had a name on a list with a transfer timestamp that, if she was reading the intake routing correctly, meant Daniel Merritt was being brought to Harlow County General in approximately 36 hours. She put her badge in her bag. They had taken the facility access badge, not her personal belongings, and walked to her car. She did not drive home. Instead, she pulled out her phone and opened a contact she had not called in 14 months. The name in her contacts was listed as a college friend, plausible enough. She held the phone for a second before dialing. It rang twice. "This is a surprise," said the voice on the other end. "I need a secure channel," Nora said, "and I need it in the next hour." A pause. "How serious?" Nora looked back at the hospital entrance. Through the glass doors, she could see the lobby, the nurses' station visible beyond, the ordinary machinery of the place moving the way it always did, unbothered, unaware. "Someone from the unit is being transferred into a compromised facility," she said. 36 hours, maybe less. And I have documentation of what's been done to the patients already inside. The pause this time was shorter. "Send me what you have. Use the secondary." "I don't have everything yet," she said, "but I know where the rest of it is." "Nora." His voice shifted, the professional register dropping into something more direct. "If you're thinking about going back in there, I'm thinking about Daniel Merritt," she said, "and 30 other names on a list I found last night." She hung up and sat in the driver's seat with the phone in her hand, watching the hospital entrance, counting the staff rotations by the patterns of movement she could see through the glass. She had been suspended. She had no credentials. She had no authority of any kind inside that building. What she had was 6 years of knowing how to get into places she wasn't supposed to be, and a very clear idea of what was waiting for Daniel Merritt when he arrived. The car was cold. She didn't start the engine. She was still watching the doors when a hospital transport van pulled into the emergency bay at the far end of the parking lot, early, ahead of the schedule she had memorized. And a gurney was unloaded with the specific, careful efficiency of a military medical transfer. The patient's face was turned away. But the arm that shifted slightly at the edge of the gurney's rail had a tattoo she recognized from 3 years and a different world entirely. Nora Callaway was out of the car before she made a conscious decision to move. She crossed the parking lot at a pace that was just under a run, close enough to purposeful that no one watching from the lobby would clock it as urgent. The transport van's rear doors were still open, the gurney locked into the bay ramp, and 2 men in civilian clothes were transferring intake paperwork to an orderly she didn't recognize. The tattoo. Left forearm, just below the wrist. A compass rose with one point broken, the kind of thing you got after a specific kind of bad deployment when you needed something permanent to mark that you'd made it through. She had seen it in a forward operating base in a place she wasn't supposed to name, on a man who had been bleeding through a field dressing she'd applied with her knee on his chest, and both of them in the dirt. Daniel Merritt. She slowed as she reached the van, adjusting her approach to look like someone who belonged there, which was a posture more than a disguise, a way of moving that said, I have a reason to be here without specifying what the reason was. One of the civilian transport men glanced at her. Patient intake, she said, not breaking stride. You're going to need to coordinate through the ER bay, he said, already looking back down at his clipboard. Of course. She angled past him just enough to see the gurney clearly. It was Daniel, older than she remembered, which was only 2 years but looked like more, the kind of aging that happened fast in that line of work. His face was gray in a way that wasn't just exhaustion. There was an IV line running, a monitoring lead attached to his left index finger, and a blood pressure cuff that was reading numbers she didn't like at a glance. His eyes were closed. He didn't know she was there. She kept walking, through the ER bay doors, into the building she'd been walked out of 40 minutes ago. The badge that opened the general areas of Harlow County General was a proximity card. Hers had been deactivated. But the ER bay entrance was on a push-bar system that the transport team had just come through, and the door hadn't fully closed before she reached it, and nobody was watching the 6-second gap between the transport team entering and her following. Inside, she moved with the flow of staff, head up, purposeful, not looking around in the way that drew attention. She knew this floor. She had worked it for 4 months. She knew which corners were blind, which stations were understaffed at shift change, and which supply rooms were accessible without the higher clearance keycard. She also knew that she had a very short window before someone recognized her face. She needed 3 things. She needed to see Merritt's intake documentation before it got routed to whatever team Pruitt had waiting for him. She needed to reach her locker, or what was left of it, for the backup she had placed there 2 days ago, when she'd started to understand how this might end. And she needed to make contact with whoever was on the other end of her earlier phone call in a way that transmitted what she had without exposing the channel. The intake documentation was the priority. The ER admission desk was staffed by 2 nurses she knew by name and by temperament. Lorraine, who had been at Harlow for 11 years and moved through her shifts with the flat efficiency of someone who had given up being surprised. And Tyler, a second year who was good at his job in a tentative, constantly seeking approval way that made him ask for sign-off on things he was fully capable of handling alone. She had worked alongside both of them without issue. She had never given either of them a reason to watch her closely. She also had no idea whether the suspension order had been communicated to floor staff yet, or whether Pruitt had kept it quiet pending the formal HR process. One way to find out. She approached the desk from the supply corridor side, coming around the corner as if she'd come from the back rather than the bay. Tyler was on the phone. Lorraine was typing. New military transfer just came in, Nora said, to neither of them specifically, flipping open the logbook on the desk counter. I need to pull the intake routing before it goes upstairs. That one's already flagged, Lorraine said without looking up. Administration called down. Special handling. Right, that's why they sent me. Nora kept her voice flat, a little tired, the sound of someone executing an instruction they found tedious. She had found in 4 months of hospital work that the most effective camouflage was the effect of mild inconvenience. No one questioned mild inconvenience. Everyone in this building felt it constantly. Lorraine looked up. Something shifted in her face, not alarm, more like a door closing. I thought you were She stopped. They pulled me back in for the transfer, Nora said. Pruitt's call. Specialty patient. It was a gamble. Lorraine was experienced enough to verify, and also tired enough to let things move if they were moving in the right direction. Nora watched the calculation happen in real time. The folder's not here yet, Lorraine said finally. Transport team brings it to triage. Should be at Station 3. Thanks. She walked away before Lorraine could think about it too hard. Station 3 was a small alcove triage room off the main ER corridor, used for incoming patient review before bed assignment. The transport team was there, and with them was a physician she didn't know. Middle-aged, ID badge turned so she couldn't read the name. The particular composed expression of someone who had been briefed and was waiting to execute a plan. The intake folder was in his hands. She couldn't get to it without creating a scene she couldn't control. She pivoted without breaking stride, turned left, went through the double doors into the main corridor, and walked to the staff bathroom 40 feet down on the right. She locked the door behind her, stood with her back against it for 3 seconds, and let herself think. She had seen enough. Merritt's vitals were bad. The monitoring parameters she'd clocked on the transport gurney, low blood pressure, the specific gray coloring, the way the IV line was running at a rate she associated with volume replacement rather than routine hydration, told her he had lost blood, or was still losing it, or both. The official military transfer documentation would list whatever injury rationale had been cleared for transport. What it wouldn't tell her was whether that injury was being treated accurately or whether he had already been handed to the Whitmore protocol. She pulled out her phone, texted the secondary contact she'd used earlier. Not a message, just a location pin and a timestamp, which was the signal they'd established in the last call for "I'm in position and I need extraction coordination within this window." The response came in 40 seconds, a single character, K. She pocketed the phone and checked her watch. 11 minutes since she'd entered the building. She needed to move. Her locker was on the second floor in the staff changing area accessible from the main elevator bank. The changing area was used most heavily at shift change, which was in 22 minutes. If she was there before shift change, it would be quiet. If she was there during, it would be crowded enough that one more person moving through wouldn't be conspicuous. She left the bathroom, went to the stairwell at the end of the corridor, and took the stairs to the second floor. The changing area was at the end of the hall. She pushed through the door and checked the room. 3 lockers occupied by bags, no people. Good. Her locker was number 47. They had escorted her to it this morning under observation, which meant they had watched her take her personal bag, her jacket, her phone charger. What they hadn't seen her take was the small waterproof document sleeve she had taped to the underside of the locker's top shelf 2 days ago, pushed back into the corner where it sat flush with the metal and would register to a casual search as part of the shelf itself. She opened the locker with her combination, reached in, found the sleeve, peeled it free. Inside, a folded paper copy of the key documents she had memorized, a secondary phone, a basic one, prepaid, loaded with one contact, and a USB drive containing the files she had quietly transferred during her last authorized computer session. She had prepared for this, not because she'd been sure it would come to this, but because in her experience, the moment you stopped preparing for the worst case was the moment the worst case arrived. She closed the locker, put the document sleeve in the inner pocket of her jacket, and left the changing area. In the hallway, she nearly walked directly into Dr. Marcus Thorne. He was coming from the elevator, a coffee in one hand, his ID badge swinging. He saw her face before she could recalibrate, and the sequence of recognition played across his features with the sluggish quality of something that didn't quite make sense yet. A person in a place they weren't supposed to be, wearing an expression that was controlled in a way that registered as suspicious precisely because of how controlled it was. Callaway. He stopped. Dr. Thorne. You're not supposed to be in this building. He said it slowly, like he was checking his own memory. I left something in my locker. She held up nothing, which was a mistake, but she covered it by angling her jacket pocket forward slightly. Personal medication. I'm diabetic. She wasn't diabetic. He didn't know that. Or, she ran the calculation. He might know that if he'd reviewed her personnel file, which he may or may not have done in the last hour. He looked at her. The slow register shifted into something more alert. I'm going to need you to come with me, he said. I was just leaving. That's not a request. She looked at him for a moment. He was bigger than her by a significant margin and stood in the center of the hallway in a way that would require her to go through him or back the way she'd come, and she'd come from a dead end. She had 3 options, and 2 of them involved making a scene that would bring security before she'd transmitted anything. She went with him. He took her to his office on the second floor. Not a conference room, his personal office, which was either a sign of arrogance or a sign that he wanted this conversation off the formal record. The office was organized in the way of someone who worked hard and didn't spend time decorating. Stacked files, a whiteboard covered in clinical schedules, a desk that had too much on it to be merely symbolic of status. He closed the door and sat down across from her. "You were suspended this morning," he said. "You surrendered your access badge. You've been in this building for—" He checked his watch. "Approximately 15 minutes without authorization." "Approximately," she agreed. "That's trespassing." "It might be." She put her hands in her lap. "Or it's an employee retrieving personal medical supplies from her locker, which most HR frameworks would treat as a reasonable exception to a pending suspension. You're not going to HR framework your way out of this." "I'm not trying to." He studied her. There was something behind the authority in his face. Not discomfort, exactly. More like a man who had decided on a course of action and was now encountering a variable he hadn't accounted for. "What were you actually doing in that locker?" he said. "I told you." "Nora." He used her first name without warning, which changed the register of the conversation in a way she noticed. "I've been at this hospital for 9 years. I've seen nurses get in over their heads trying to fix things, report things, and I've seen what happens to them." "Is that a warning?" "It's an observation." She looked at him. He was holding himself carefully, the way people did when they were trying to occupy a middle position they were increasingly aware wouldn't hold. "Dr. Thorne," she said, "there's a patient in your emergency department right now who was transferred through a routing channel connected to a program that has materially harmed at least a dozen people in this building. I found evidence of altered records, falsified billing, and unauthorized procedures conducted in Suite 14 by a team that is not on this hospital's staff roster." She paused. "You can call security right now and have me removed, and that will be the last 15 minutes you have before this becomes something you cannot manage." The room was very quiet. "Or," she said, "you can give me 12 minutes. He didn't call security, but he also didn't say yes. He stood up and turned to the whiteboard and stood with his back to her for a moment that stretched long enough to be uncomfortable. "Suite 14, he said, to the whiteboard. "Yes." "The Whitmore Group." It wasn't a question. She kept her face still. He knew the name. The question was how he knew it, and in what capacity. "They told me they were a research partnership," he said, "coordinated through Pruitt. They said they had IRB approval, patient consent, the full—" He stopped. "I didn't ask to see the documentation." "No," Nora said, "you didn't." He turned around. His face had changed. Whatever calculation had been running had come out somewhere he hadn't expected. "How bad is it?" he said. "The patient downstairs," she said, "needs to be assessed by someone who is not connected to the Whitmore protocol. Now, before whatever intake plan Pruitt has already set in motion gets further along." She watched him decide. It was not a clean decision, she could see that. He was a man who had built a career on a particular understanding of how this institution worked, and that understanding was in the process of being revised in real time, and revision of that kind hurt in a specific way. Not just professionally, but personally, the discomfort of someone who had been, on some level, complicit in something by not looking closely enough. She knew that feeling. She had her own version of it. "What do you need?" he said. "Access to his intake file, and 15 minutes with him before the Whitmore team touches him." Thorne moved to his desk and picked up the phone. What followed was 15 minutes of the kind of controlled urgency that hospital environments were designed to absorb, movement that looked routine to anyone not tracking it closely, decisions made in corridors and relayed in clinical shorthand. Thorne was, whatever else he was, competent. He redirected Merritt's intake through a standard attending pathway, citing a protocol conflict on the specialty admission, which bought time without raising immediate flags. Nora followed him to the ER with the specific neutrality of someone who was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had never told him about her background. She hadn't needed to. He had looked at her in his office and seen someone who was not asking permission, and that had been enough. Daniel Merritt was in Bay 4, the IV still running, a pulse ox on his finger, his eyes open now and tracking the ceiling in the unfocused way of someone fighting through medication haze. He turned his head when she stepped into the bay. His eyes found her face. Recognition didn't arrive immediately. It moved in slowly, the way it did when a memory had to travel from a very different context. Callaway, he said. Hey, Danny? His voice was rough. What are you doing in a hospital? Working, she said. How are you feeling? Like I got hit by a truck that was also on fire. He coughed once. Standard Tuesday. She checked his chart, running through the vitals, the intake notes, the medication currently running. Thorne stood back and let her work. She found 3 things in the first 2 minutes. The blood pressure was dropping in a pattern inconsistent with the listed injury. There was a notation of a compound in his blood work she didn't recognize from the abbreviated lab panel, and the intake routing had a secondary flag she now recognized as the marker the Whitmore team used to identify incoming patients. He was already tagged. She leaned close to him. Danny, listen to me. Did anyone approach you before the transfer? Anyone who wasn't military personnel? His eyes sharpened fractionally. Even half-medicated, the question had the right shape to pull him back into focus. Civilian team, he said, at the staging facility. Said they were doing a medical intake assessment. He paused. They gave me something. Said it was for pain management. What did it look like? Blue cap, clear fluid. She straightened up. Looked at Thorne. His face said he understood. We need a full panel, she said. Full tox, not the abbreviated intake version. And we need to run it through the county lab, not the hospital's internal system. That'll take 6 hours minimum. Then we need to start it now. Thorne picked up the bay phone and started making calls. Nora turned back to Merritt and ran through a rapid secondary assessment, the kind that didn't require equipment, just hands and training, and found what she was looking for in the lymph node response along his neck and the specific pattern of his breathing. She knew what they had given him. She had seen the symptom cluster before in a document she had found in the restricted archive 3 weeks ago, in a section of case notes that described the Whitmore protocol's experimental compound and its physiological effects. She had thought at the time that it looked like a modified version of a vascular disruption agent, the kind of thing that was genuinely being researched in controlled settings for specific surgical applications, but was violently unsafe at the dosage levels the case notes suggested. They hadn't started the full protocol on him yet. The blue cap injection at the staging facility was the primer, the first stage of a 2-part process that required a follow-up dose administered within a specific window. She calculated the timeline based on what she could observe. They had roughly 4 hours. She was leaning over the bay railing, writing a medication note in the margin of the chart, when the bay curtain opened and Director Pruitt walked in. He was not alone. Behind him were 2 security officers and a woman Nora had not seen before. 50s, a dark blazer, no hospital ID, the particular bearing of someone who had authority that didn't require a lanyard. Pruitt's face was controlled, but his jaw was tight. Miss Callaway, he said, I need to understand why you're in my hospital. She's assisting with a specialty intake, Thorne said. She's suspended. I reinstated her on a temporary consult basis, my authority as attending on this case. Pruitt looked at Thorne with the flat expression of a man who had not expected resistance from this particular direction and was recalculating how to handle it. The woman in the blazer had not spoken. She was watching Nora in a way that had nothing to do with the administrative situation. Marcus, Pruitt said, this patient's intake has already been coordinated. I'm aware. I've redirected it. You don't have the authority to... I have attending authority over any patient in my emergency department. Thorne's voice was steady. If you want to challenge that, you can take it to the board. In the meantime, this patient is receiving standard care. The standoff lasted 8 seconds, which was long in that kind of silence. Then the woman in the blazer put her hand on Pruitt's arm, lightly, and said something to him in a voice too low to hear. He looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. Not agreement, more like a decision to retreat and regroup. We'll discuss this upstairs, Pruitt said. To Nora, you'll be hearing from legal. He left. The security officers went with him. The woman in the blazer did not leave. She stood at the edge of the bay and looked at Nora with an expression that Nora couldn't fully read. Appraising, but not hostile. You're Callaway, the woman said. Yes. How much have you documented? Nora looked at her. Who are you? The woman reached into her jacket and produced an ID card, holding it so Nora could read it. The agency identifier on it was one Nora recognized. The name on the card was Reyes M. We've been watching Harlow County General for 7 months, Reyes said. We've been waiting for someone inside to build a case from the patient record end. We couldn't get our own people in quickly enough. She paused. How much do you have? Billing records, altered charts, a scheduling document for Suite 14, a tox pattern on this patient consistent with the Whitmore compound, and enough documentation of the intake routing system to trace the patient selection criteria. Nora watched the woman's face. What were you missing? The billing structure, Reyes said. We could see the money coming out, but we couldn't trace the patient end. We didn't know how they were selecting people. They're targeting terminal and near-terminal cases, Nora said. People whose deaths, if the protocol went wrong, would look like natural progression of existing conditions. They've been running an unauthorized drug trial, billing the treatments as standard procedures, and using the Whitmore group as a buffer between the hospital's official operations and what's actually happening in Suite 14. Reyes looked at her for a moment. You got all of this in 4 months, as a floor nurse. They weren't watching the right people, Nora said. Merritt coughed from the bay bed. Both women looked at him. His eyes were clearer now. The IV Thorne had adjusted was running better through him, and the monitoring numbers had stabilized fractionally. Callaway, he said. Are you actually a nurse? Yes? And also something else? I was. She looked back at Reyes. I need a federal hold on this patient and full access to the Whitmore case files within the next 4 hours. Whatever they gave him needs a counter protocol that I can't develop without knowing the full compound breakdown. I can get you access to what we have, Reyes said. We've had 2 compound samples from prior cases, but our biochemist hasn't been able to isolate the interaction mechanism. Give me the samples in a lab. Reyes looked at her with an expression that had something complicated in it. How do I know you can do that? Nora set the chart down on the bay tray. Because 4 hours from now, if nobody does it, this man is going to go into vascular failure that will look exactly like a complication of his existing injury, and whoever is running this program will write it up that way, and then they'll move on to the next name on the list. She held Reyes's gaze. And I spent 6 years in a job where that kind of outcome was not acceptable. The monitoring alarm on Merritt's line began to sound. A low, steady tone. Not emergency level yet, but trending in the wrong direction. Thorne moved immediately, adjusting the IV rate, calling for the nurse on bay duty. The room became briefly organized around the medical reality of the moment, which was what it was supposed to be organized around. Reyes stepped back. She was looking at Nora with the same unreadable assessment. There's something you should know, she said. Nora waited. The Whitmore group isn't just a research operation. Reyes kept her voice low under the activity in the bay. Pruitt didn't bring them in. They were already here when Pruitt took the director position. They chose this hospital. They've been embedded in the infrastructure for 3 years. Nora held very still. Who brought them in? Reyes reached into her jacket again. This time she produced a single printed photograph. A still from what looked like security footage, grainy but readable. 2 men talking in a corridor. One was the unidentified physician she had seen with Merritt's intake folder. The other was a face she recognized from a different context entirely. Her hand didn't shake, but it took effort. That's General? She stopped. Yes, Reyes said. Nora looked at the photograph for 3 more seconds. Then she handed it back. The monitoring alarm had been silenced. Thorne was talking to the bay nurse in a low, rapid voice. Merritt was watching the ceiling again, breathing shallowly. 4 hours. She had the document sleeve in her pocket, the USB drive, the notebook, and a federal agent standing 2 feet away who had just told her that the conspiracy she'd been tracking inside one hospital went somewhere she had not anticipated and would not have predicted. She looked at the bay curtain, through which Pruitt and his security team had exited 2 minutes ago, heading upstairs to regroup. She thought about the list of 31 names. She thought about Suite 14 and the gurney she'd watched move through the corridor at 11:47 p.m. She thought about the photograph Reyes had just put back in her jacket. The lab, Nora said. What? The samples you mentioned. I need them in the next 30 minutes. Reyes was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that expression she still couldn't fully classify. There's a holding vehicle in the east parking structure, Reyes said. Level 2, Bay 14. Of course it's 14, Nora said. She was already moving toward the bay curtain when Reyes spoke again. Callaway. The agent's voice stopped her without her fully meaning to stop. The person in that photograph. If this goes where I think it's going to go, this isn't just the hospital anymore. Nora turned back, one hand on the curtain. I know, she said. She pushed through and walked into the corridor, and the hospital moved around her. Orderlies and nurses and the distant sound of a phone ringing at the station down the hall. And she kept her pace steady and her face neutral because she was 4 hours from the point of no return, and there was no room for anything that wasn't forward motion. Behind her, in Bay 4, Daniel Merritt's blood pressure began to drop. The stairwell door hadn't fully closed behind her before she was calculating. Bay 14, Level 2, East parking structure. 3 minutes on foot if she took the service corridor instead of the main lobby. She had the document sleeve, the USB, and what she'd just learned about the photograph pressing against every other thought like a hand on a wound. She kept walking. The service corridor ran behind the ER department and connected to the parking structure through a loading bay that was used for supply deliveries, and occasionally for things that didn't appear on supply manifests. She had found this route 2 weeks into her tenure at Harlow, during a shift where she'd needed somewhere quiet to eat and think, and she had filed it away the same way she filed everything, not consciously planning to use it, just keeping the map current. The loading bay door opened from the inside with a push bar. Cold air hit her when she stepped through. The parking structure was one of those poured concrete buildings that held winter longer than the calendar did. She went to the stairwell, took it up one level, and came out onto a floor of vehicles that was maybe a third occupied at this hour. Bay 14 was in the far corner. A dark blue SUV, nondescript, government plates that were deliberately difficult to run quickly. The rear windows were tinted. She walked toward it steadily, not checking over her shoulder because checking over your shoulder when you were trying not to look surveilled was the same as announcing you felt surveilled. The rear door opened before she reached it. Inside, 2 people she didn't know, and a field lab setup that occupied the back seats and folding table, centrifuge, sample trays, a laptop running analysis software she recognized from federal procurement documents she'd once seen during a joint briefing. The samples were in sealed biohazard containers, labeled with case numbers. The second person in the vehicle looked up from the laptop. Male, 30s, the specific kind of tired that came from working a case too long without resolution. You're Callaway, he said. Yes. Reyes said you wanted the compound breakdown. I need the full panel, not just the isolated samples. Do you have the spectral analysis from the prior cases? He pulled up a file on the laptop and turned it toward her. She looked at it for 40 seconds without speaking. The compound was what she'd suspected, a vascular disruption agent, modified for delayed onset, the kind of modification that required genuine biochemical sophistication and also explained why Merritt's blood pressure had been trending in the wrong direction at the wrong rate for the listed injury. The modification created a 2-stage effect. The initial injection primed the vascular response without triggering it, and the second dose, which had to be administered within a 5 to 6 hour window, completed the mechanism. Without the second dose, the compound would metabolize incompletely, and the patient would experience a progressive hemodynamic deterioration that looked, at autopsy, like vascular complication secondary to trauma. Lethal and deniable. What's the elapsed time since his first injection? The analyst asked. Transport documentation says the staging facility assessment was 3 hours ago. If that's accurate, we're inside the window. What do you need? Acetylcysteine as a precursor, high dose, and a phosphodiesterase inhibitor, not sildenafil, something with a faster IV onset. She was already running it. The compound disrupts nitric oxide signaling at the endothelial level. If we restore that pathway before the second dose is administered, the first injection becomes non-functional. His body clears it. You're certain about that mechanism? No, she said. But I'm certain enough to move on it, and the alternative is watching him deteriorate until the window closes and we have nothing to counter with. She looked up from the laptop. Does Reyes have access to the hospital pharmacy? She has a federal hold on the patient that gives her authority to direct treatment. Then I need those 2 medications ordered in the next 20 minutes and administered by someone who knows what they're doing. You, he said. I've been suspended. Reyes can reinstate you under federal authority for duration of the hold. It was a workaround that would create enormous legal complexity later. She filed that thought away. Get Reyes on the line, she said. The call took 4 minutes she didn't have to spare. Reyes was efficient. No excess language, just confirmation and instruction. The medications would be ordered through the federal hold protocol, which bypassed the hospital's normal pharmacy chain and drew directly from the emergency federal dispensary that Nora had not previously known was connected to the parking structure's supply bay. That detail told her more about how long this operation had been running than anything else. She was back inside the building in 11 minutes. Thorne was waiting in the corridor outside Bay 4. He looked like a man who had spent the last 15 minutes having a conversation he wished he could unhave. Pruitt called the board chair, he said quietly. They're convening an emergency session in the third-floor conference room. He's framing it as a staff management issue. You, unauthorized access, liability. How long do we have before they formalize something? An hour? Maybe less. I need 40 minutes with the patient and a pharmacist who isn't connected to the Whitmore operation. Thorne ran a hand through his hair, the gesture of someone who had moved past the point of institutional caution into something more personal. I know a pharmacist. She's been on my radar for a while. She flagged some medication discrepancies to me 6 weeks ago, and I told her to document it and let it go. He paused. I shouldn't have told her to let it go. No, Nora said, but you can fix that now. He made the call from the corridor. The pharmacist, a woman named Valdez, according to Thorne, arrived in Bay 7 minutes later carrying the medications Nora had requested and wearing the expression of someone who had been waiting for an opportunity she wasn't sure was real. Nora administered the acetylcysteine first, adjusting the IV rate to deliver the loading dose over 15 minutes rather than the standard 30, a compression she was comfortable with given Merritt's weight and current hemodynamic state, a risk she calculated against the time constraint and accepted. Valdez watched her hands without comment, which was the most meaningful kind of assessment. Merritt was awake through it. He had pulled himself back to full consciousness in the way that people with his training did, not by feeling better, but by deciding that being conscious was more important than how it felt. Tell me what's happening, he said. Someone at your staging facility gave you the first stage of a 2-part compound. It's designed to cause vascular failure that looks like trauma complication. He absorbed this with the stillness of someone doing rapid threat reassessment. Why? Because you were routed to this hospital, and this hospital has been selecting patients for an unauthorized drug trial. She checked the IV line. You were on a list. How did I get on a list? I don't know yet. That was true. The photograph Reyes had shown her, the unidentified physician with the military connection, was a thread she hadn't had time to pull. Right now, the priority is clearing the compound before anyone can administer the second dose. And if they do, they won't. She said it flatly, which was what the situation required, and not because she was certain. The phosphodiesterase inhibitor went in at the 22-minute mark. She sat with him through the next 15 minutes, monitoring his pressure manually rather than relying on the automatic cuff, watching for the response pattern she needed. Valdez stayed, which was more than Nora had asked for, checking the drug interaction data on her tablet. At the 30-minute mark, Merritt's blood pressure began to stabilize. Not dramatically. There was no clean reversal, no obvious inflection point, just a number that stopped falling and stayed at a level that wasn't good but was sustainable. The color in his face shifted by a degree. That's working, Valdez said quietly. It's early, Nora said, but it's working. She moved to the bay tray and began pulling together the documentation. Medication records, monitoring timestamps, the compound analysis from Reyes's team, cross-referenced with the patient intake data she had memorized. It wasn't a complete case file. It was the medical end of one. Proof that a specific patient had been administered a specific non-sanctioned compound through a civilian channel prior to hospital admission, and that the hospital's intake routing had been set to direct him toward a specific treatment team upon arrival. It was a start. The bay curtain opened at the 38-minute mark. It was not Pruitt. The man who entered was the physician she had seen with Merritt's intake folder that morning, the one with the turned badge, the prepared expression. Up close, he was perhaps 55, a face that would read as distinguished on television and was currently arranged in the careful configuration of someone who had assessed the room and found it different than expected. He looked at Merritt. He looked at the IV line. He looked at Nora. You modified the intake protocol, he said. I'm treating a patient, Nora said. Under whose authority? Federal hold, Agent Reyes, currently on premises. The physician's expression didn't change in any way that was visible. But something in the room changed. The particular quality of stillness that happened when someone recalibrated from a position of control into something more carefully managed. I see, he said. He didn't leave. He stood at the edge of the bay and looked at Merritt's monitoring display with the focused attention of someone reading data they needed. I'm going to need you to leave this bay, Nora said. I have attending privileges at this facility. Your name isn't on the attending roster, Thorne said. He had come through the curtain behind the man, which Nora had not heard, and stood with the authority of someone on their own floor. I checked. You're listed as a visiting consultant under an administrative arrangement I'm now aware has not been formally cleared through the medical staff office. That's an administrative matter. Yes. So is the federal hold on this patient, which supersedes your consulting arrangement. Thorne held the man's gaze. Get out of my ER. The physician looked at him for 3 seconds. Then he left. Nora tracked the sound of his footsteps on the corridor floor until they faded. Who is he? Thorne said. I don't know his name. She turned back to Merritt's chart. But he's been here before, and he's connected to the Whitmore program at a level above Pruitt. Above Pruitt. Thorne's voice had a particular quality. How far above? She thought about the photograph. I don't know yet. What she did know was that the physician's arrival and departure had a timeline quality to it. A man checking on a situation and then going somewhere to respond to it. She had maybe 15 minutes before whatever he was going to do next became apparent. She finished the documentation, secured it in the sleeve along with the medication records, and handed the USB to Valdez. Keep that in your personal possession, she said. Not your locker. On your person. Valdez took it without asking why. Nora looked at Merritt. I need you to be difficult, she said. He raised an eyebrow. That's the first easy thing you've asked me today. If anyone comes in here and tries to adjust your medications or administer anything, you refuse. Loudly. How loudly? Loudly enough that Thorne can hear it from the station. I can do that. He paused. Callaway. Whatever is happening here. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. She pulled the curtain and stepped into the corridor. Thorne was at her shoulder. I need to get to the 3rd floor, she said. The board meeting. You can't walk into a board meeting. Not the meeting, the floor. She was already moving. The administrative server room is adjacent to the conference room. The Whitmore billing records Rias's team couldn't trace. They're in the hospital's internal accounting system, and the accounting system has a manual backup terminal in that room that doesn't require the same access level as the main administrative network. How do you know that? Because the manual backup terminal was installed in 2019, and the hospital's IT policy hasn't been updated since 2017. She looked at him. I read the IT compliance report when I was trying to understand the records system. You read the IT compliance report. It was a slow overnight. She pushed through the stairwell door. I need 10 minutes in that room. Thorne followed her up 2 flights, which she hadn't asked him to do and didn't tell him not to. At the 3rd floor, the corridor was quieter. Administrative offices, the conference room at the far end, its door closed, the distant sound of voices inside. The server room was to the left, a plain door with a standard keypad. I don't have clearance for that room, Thorne said. I know. She examined the keypad. It was the same model as the secondary access panels throughout the hospital, and the maintenance override code for that model was printed in the 2019 installation report she had read on a slow overnight. She entered it. The door opened. That's not something I just saw, Thorne said. No, she agreed, and went in. The room was small and cold and smelled like electrical equipment. Server racks along 2 walls, a manual terminal on a standing desk, the steady ambient noise of cooling fans. She sat at the terminal and navigated the accounting system through the backup interface, which was slower than the main network but logged access differently. Specifically, in a way that would show as a system maintenance check rather than a user query, because whoever had designed the manual backup had prioritized functionality over audit trails. She was looking for the billing records that sat between the Whitmore Clinical Partnership's external internal invoicing and the hospital's internal account coding. Rias's team had the external side. What they needed was the internal categorization, the way the hospital had coded the Whitmore procedures in its own records to make the billing look like standard care. Without that, the external invoicing looked like legitimate hospital vendor payments, and the case for fraud required proving intent, which required showing that the hospital knew it was coding fraudulent procedures. She found it in 11 minutes. It was worse than she had anticipated, which was something she was becoming accustomed to in relation to this particular investigation. The internal coding system had a secondary classification layer, a set of procedure codes that didn't appear in any standard medical billing database, used exclusively for the Whitmore cases, cross-referenced to patient files through a numbering system that was designed to look like an administrative record-keeping system, and was actually a patient enrollment database for an unauthorized drug trial. She copied everything to a process that would route it to a secondary output log, not the USB, which she no longer had, but a network path that Reyes's analyst had given her as an extraction channel. It took 4 minutes to transfer. While it was transferring, she heard voices in the corridor outside the server room. Not the board meeting. Those voices were still at the far end of the hall, contained. These were closer, moving toward her. 2 people, low and quick. She finished the transfer, closed the accounting interface, and stood. The server room door opened. The physician she had seen in the ER was there. Next to him was a security officer she didn't recognize. Not hospital security. The wrong uniform, the wrong posture. Private. "Ms. Callaway," the physician said. "Step away from the terminal." She didn't move. "Who are you?" "That's not relevant." "It's going to be relevant very shortly." He looked past her at the terminal screen, which showed the closed accounting interface. Nothing active, nothing visible. She watched him assess whether she had accomplished what he thought she had come here to accomplish, and she watched him decide he couldn't be certain. "You're going to come with us," he said. "No," she said. "I'm not." The security officer moved forward. He was larger than her by a significant margin, trained in the way that private security sometimes was and sometimes wasn't. This one moved like he was, economical and decided. She took 1 step back, which put the server rack behind her left shoulder and narrowed the angle he had to work with. She had not been in a physical confrontation in 14 months. The last one had been in a situation she was not supposed to discuss and had not discussed. She had wondered, in the abstract, whether the specific kind of preparedness she'd spent 6 years building would atrophy into something theoretical. It had not. The security officer had a reach advantage and used it, which was the right instinct in the wrong execution. Reaching forward in a confined space meant extending your center of gravity without the room to recover it. She stepped into it instead of back, controlled the extended arm, used the momentum he'd generated, and put him into the server rack behind her with enough force that one of the panels dented inward, and the cooling fan in that rack changed pitch. He went down, not out. She hadn't wanted to do more damage than necessary, but down and disoriented, which bought her 6 seconds. She stepped past him toward the door. The physician hadn't moved. He stood in the doorway, which blocked her exit, and looked at her with an expression that had migrated from controlled to something harder to categorize. "That's not going to help you," he said. "Get out of the way," she said. "You don't understand what you've become involved in." "I think I understand it reasonably well." She was watching his hands, his shoulders, the way he was distributing his weight. He wasn't a fighter, the stance was wrong, but he was blocking the door deliberately, which meant he was buying time for something. She thought about what he was buying time for. Then she heard it. The elevator at the end of the corridor opening, the sound of more than one person moving fast. She made a decision in approximately 1 second and executed it in the next 3. She went through the door and into the physician, who did not move as efficiently as she needed him to, which cost her 2 seconds and resulted in her elbow connecting with his shoulder harder than she'd intended. He hit the corridor wall. She was moving before he'd finished the impact, turning left, away from the elevator toward the stairwell at the far end of the corridor. She heard the elevator doors and multiple sets of footsteps. The door of the 3rd-floor conference room opened. Director Pruitt stood in the doorway, and behind him she could see the board members assembled. 7, 8 people, faces she didn't recognize, the interrupted quality of a meeting being interrupted. Pruitt looked at her in the corridor, at the physician against the wall. At the stairwell door she was 3 steps from. The footsteps from the elevator were close. She hit the stairwell door and took the stairs fast, not running with the sound that running made. Controlled descent, hand on the rail for the turns, tracking the sound above her. 1 flight, 2. She came out on the ground floor and went right, through the service corridor, back toward the ER. Thorne was in the corridor at the ER entrance. He saw her face and didn't ask. "Reyes," Nora said. "Now." He had the agent's number. He dialed it and handed her the phone, and she was already talking before it fully connected. "The billing records are transferred through the extraction channel," she said. "And the person in the photograph is in this building. He's on the 3rd floor, if you want him before he leaves." "We've been tracking him since he arrived," Reyes said. Her voice had a different quality. Not calm, something more active. "Callaway. Something's happened." Nora stopped walking. "Merritt's Bay," Reyes said. She was already turning. The ER was 20 feet back. She went through the doors and down the row of curtained bays to number 4 and pulled the curtain back. Merritt was in the bed. He was conscious. He was also not alone. A nurse Nora didn't recognize stood at the IV pole, one hand on the line. She had an injection port open. In her other hand was a syringe. It was a clear fluid with a blue cap. "Stop," Nora said. The nurse looked at her with an expression that was not the expression of a nurse who had been interrupted during a routine procedure. It was something flatter, more deliberate. "This patient's medication was ordered by the attending," the nurse said. "It wasn't," Nora said. "Step back from the line." "I need you to leave this bay." The nurse's hand moved toward the IV port. Merritt's hand closed around her wrist before the syringe reached the line. His grip, even sedated, even compromised, had 6 years of physical conditioning behind it. "I don't think so," he said. The nurse pulled. Merritt held. The syringe dropped to the floor of the bay, and Nora was already at the IV pole, checking the line for any prior access point, any injection that had happened before she'd walked in. The line was clean. Nothing had gone in. Nora picked up the syringe from the floor. She looked at it. She looked at the nurse, who was not struggling anymore, who was standing with the stillness of someone running a very different calculation than the one she'd been running 20 seconds ago. "Thorne!" Nora called. He was already in the doorway. "Get security. Real security." She kept her eyes on the nurse. "And call Reyes. Tell her we have the 2nd dose." The nurse looked at the syringe in Nora's hand, at Merritt still gripping her wrist, at Thorne in the doorway. She had the particular composed quality of someone who had prepared for multiple outcomes and was now selecting from the available ones. Then she did something Nora didn't expect. She smiled. "You have a syringe," the nurse said. "You don't have what's already in his blood work from this morning's intake panel." Nora went very still. "The panel drawn at 8:14 a.m., the nurse said, before the federal hold was filed. A standard intake panel for a trauma admission, ordered by the attending of record at that time." She paused. "Check his blood panel from this morning, Ms. Callaway, the one that's already in his chart." Nora looked at Merritt. He had released the nurse's wrist. His face was the controlled neutral of someone absorbing new information in a situation that had just become more complicated. She moved to the bedside tablet and pulled up the morning labs. The intake panel from 8:14 a.m., drawn before Thorne had redirected the case, before the federal hold, before any of it, showed a flagged result in the coagulation panel that she had not been looking for because she had not known to look for it. A compound marker, consistent with a secondary agent, not the one she had counteracted. A different mechanism. A different timeline. She stood at the tablet with the morning lab results on the screen, and the numbers told her something she was not ready to hear, which was that she had been treating the wrong compound. The nurse was at the bay curtain now, Thorne's hand on her arm, hospital security arriving in the corridor. All of that was happening at a distance that suddenly felt irrelevant. Nora looked at the numbers. "Danny," she said, "how do you feel?" He thought about it with the honest assessment of someone who had learned not to minimize. "Headache," he said. "Started about an hour ago. I thought it was the medication." Headache. Coagulation disruption. An agent designed to look like a different agent, while the first one drew attention. She needed a specialist she didn't have. She needed a lab that could turn around a full toxicology panel in 40 minutes. She needed options that the 4 walls of this hospital might not contain, because the 4 walls of this hospital were compromised in ways she was still discovering. She pulled out her phone and dialed the number she had not used in 2 years, the one that bypassed channels and went directly to a clearance level she no longer technically held. It rang once. A voice she recognized answered. "Callaway," said Brigadier General Marin Solis. "I've been waiting for you to call." Nora turned away from the bay, keeping her voice low. I have a soldier who's been administered 2 unknown agents through a compromised hospital intake system, she said. I need a military medical extraction team and a biochemical specialist at Harlow County General in the next 30 minutes. I know about Harlow, Solis said, and the weight of those 4 words settled over the conversation like a change in air pressure. Callaway, how much do you have? Enough to close it, Nora said. Then I'm already moving. A pause. You should know. We're not the only ones. There are 3 other hospitals in the network. Nora closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. How long have you known? She said. Long enough, said Solis, and her voice had the specific quality of someone answering a question they did not enjoy answering. I'll explain when I'm there. 30 minutes. The line went dead. Nora lowered the phone. Behind her, in Bay 4, the monitoring alarm began sounding, not the low warning tone from before, but the higher register of something that was moving faster than it should. She was back at the bedside before the alarm's second cycle completed. The coagulation disruption was moving faster than the first compound had. Different mechanism, different timeline, and she had lost 40 minutes treating the wrong target. That was the architecture of it. The first agent as misdirection, something dramatic enough to demand attention and response, while the second compound worked quietly through the morning labs that nobody had flagged because nobody had known to look for it. She pulled the tablet back up and ran the coagulation numbers against what she knew about vascular disruption agents, cross-referencing the timing of the 8:14 a.m. draw against Merritt's current presentation. The headache was the tell, not pain from the trauma injury, but intracranial pressure response to a compound that was affecting clotting factor production at the hepatic level. If she was right, his liver was beginning to lose the signaling pathway that regulated thrombin production, which meant he was trending toward a coagulopathy that would look, on chart, like disseminated intravascular coagulation secondary to trauma. Deniable. Again. Thorne, she said. He was in the doorway, one hand still on the nurse who had brought the syringe. Hospital security had arrived and was handling the physical situation, which freed his attention. Fresh frozen plasma, she said. Now. And I need a direct bilirubin and a PT-INR drawn immediately, not through the hospital lab. Reyes has a field unit in the parking structure. The field unit can run a coag panel? Yes. She had confirmed this when she was in the SUV. Tell them it's a secondary agent, hepatic disruption pathway, probable thrombin suppression. They'll know what to run. He was already on his phone, moving down the corridor. Merritt watched her with the steady attention of a man who had decided that monitoring his own fear response was the most useful thing he could do in this moment. How bad? He said. Manageable, she said. If we move. That's not a real answer. It's the one I have. He was quiet for a moment. The woman with the syringe. She knew my name. She knew my blood type. She knew my unit designation. He paused. That information is classified at a level that doesn't come through hospital intake paperwork. Nora had registered that while it was happening and set it aside because the immediate medical priority hadn't allowed for parallel processing. She filed it back in now. Someone fed your intake data to the Whitmore operation before your transfer was completed, she said, which means the leak is on the military side, not just the hospital side. That's what I was thinking. How many people knew about your transfer? My CO, the staging facility medical officer, whoever processed the routing order. He stopped. And whoever that physician was, the one you apparently ran into upstairs. She thought about the photograph Reyes had shown her, the unidentified physician with the man whose rank she had recognized and not said aloud. Solis is coming, she said. She'll bring clarity on the military side. You trust her? The question landed in a way that required honesty rather than reassurance. She knew about Harlow before I called. She said they were already moving. She looked at him. I don't know what already moving means yet, but she answered, and she didn't waste time. That's not the same as trust. No, Nora said. It's not. The fresh frozen plasma arrived in 9 minutes. Valdez had anticipated the order, it turned out, had already pulled it when the monitoring numbers shifted, which was the kind of practical competence that Nora was aware she had not adequately acknowledged in the chaos of the last 2 hours. She noted it. She would find a moment later. She administered the FFP and added a vitamin K push to support the clotting factor synthesis, then pulled a chair to the bedside and sat in it for the first time since she'd walked into this building at 6:43 that morning. She was running on the particular kind of second wind energy that came from sustained adrenaline, and she knew from experience that it had a hard edge. When it cut out, it cut fast. She needed to still be functional when Solace arrived. The field unit's coag panel results came back in 26 minutes. She reviewed them on Reyes's tablet. The agent brought it down personally, which meant Reyes had moved her operation from the parking structure into the building, which meant the federal presence was becoming less covert. The results confirmed her read. PT-INR elevated at 2.4 and climbing, direct bilirubin beginning to rise. The compound was targeting hepatic synthesis pathways specifically, which was more sophisticated than the first agent, less about immediate vascular disruption and more about slowly withdrawing the body's ability to manage its own hemostasis until the deficit became unrecoverable. The FFP was buying time. It wasn't a fix. "What do you need that you don't have?" Reyes said. "A hepatologist and a specific antidote that I don't have the compound identification to source yet." She looked up. "The nurse who brought the syringe. Where is she?" "Building security has her. We're taking custody. The syringe contents need to go to your field unit immediately. If we can identify the second compound from the syringe, I can work backward to the antidote protocol." Reyes nodded and relayed the instruction through her earpiece. Nora stood up, rolled her shoulders once, the only concession to fatigue she allowed herself, and walked to the bay curtain. In the corridor outside, things had shifted. She felt it before she fully processed the visual. A different quality of activity, purposeful and organized in a way that the earlier chaos hadn't been. 3 people in dark jackets who were not hospital security, moving with the unhurried certainty of people executing a plan that was already in motion. A second SUV had apparently arrived at the service bay because 2 more individuals were coming through the loading bay entrance with equipment cases. Reyes was building toward something. "How many are you?" Nora said. "Enough," Reyes said. "We've been staged in Harlow County for 72 hours waiting for the internal evidence." She looked at Nora with the specific expression she'd been wearing since the parking structure, the one Nora still couldn't fully classify. "You gave us more in one morning than 7 months of external surveillance. You had the photograph for 7 months and you didn't move. The photograph puts a person in a corridor. It doesn't prove what the corridor was being used for." Reyes paused. "Your documentation does." Nora thought about what it meant that a federal operation had been watching this hospital for 7 months while the patients in Suite 14 were being administered experimental compounds without consent. She thought about the 31 names on the list. She thought about how many of those 31 had been on a list like that 6 months ago and what had happened to them. She kept the thought clean and direct because she couldn't afford the emotional weight of it right now, but she filed it for later. Some things needed to be fully thought about eventually. "The physician from the 3rd floor," she said. "Did you get him?" "He's in custody." Reyes's voice shifted slightly. "His name is Dr. Elliot Strand. He's the director of a medical research consortium called the Oren Group, which is the parent organization of the Whitmore Clinical Partnership." She paused. "He also served as a consulting contractor for the Department of Defense Medical Research Office for 11 years. That's how the military intake data moved," Nora said. "Yes. He had access to transfer routing data for military patients through his consulting role. He's been out of that role for 3 years, but the access credentials were never fully revoked." Reyes let that land. "Someone in the DoD Medical Administration Office has been maintaining those credentials. We don't know who yet." Nora turned that over. Strand had not just selected civilian patients. He had been curating military cases, routing specific soldiers with classified injury profiles into the Whitmore trial. The compound that had been administered to Merritt was not incidentally military in its sophistication. It had been developed in a research environment with access to classified medical data on trauma physiology. The implications of that were larger than one hospital. "Solis is 20 minutes out," she said. "When she arrives, I want Strand in the same room." Reyes looked at her. "That's not standard procedure." "I know, make it happen anyway." Something in Reyes's expression, the assessment that had been running since the parking structure, resolved into a decision. "All right," she said. The next 20 minutes were the operational kind of waiting, where you kept moving because stopping would let you think about everything that could still go wrong. Nora went back to Merritt's chart, updated the medication record with the FFP administration and vitamin K push, documented the rationale in clinical terms that would survive legal review. She was aware that the documentation she was creating in real time was also evidentiary, a record of exactly what had been done to this patient and what had been done to counter it, with timestamps. Valdez appeared at the bay entrance with the syringe contents analysis from the field unit. Nora read it standing at the door. The second compound was a thrombopoietin receptor antagonist, a class of agent that suppressed platelet production by blocking the bone marrow signaling pathway. In legitimate medical use, TPO antagonists were used to treat certain blood disorders, carefully dosed and monitored. At the concentration in the syringe, 5 times therapeutic maximum, it would have caused a platelet crash within 6 hours, presenting as trauma-related coagulopathy, and the morning lab draw had delivered enough of the same compound to begin that process through a different delivery point. She knew the antidote. It wasn't elegant, high-dose L-trombopag, an oral TPO receptor agonist that would compete at the receptor level, but the field unit would have it in their emergency pharmacology stock, or could source it in under an hour. She relayed the compound identification to Reyes's analyst and watched the logistical response happen faster than she expected. The federal operation, for all the complexity of its position, ran efficiently when it had a clear target. Merritt's antidote was in his IV line within 41 minutes of Nora reading the syringe analysis. It was not a clean fix. The compound had been working for hours, and the receptor competition would take time to shift the balance. But the trajectory changed. The INR stopped climbing, held at 2.7, and the monitoring numbers stabilized into a profile she could work with. Merritt looked at the IV bag with the specific expression of someone watching their own treatment with insufficient information. "Is that the right thing?" he said. "It's the right thing," she said. "It'll take a few hours to fully clear. Will I know when it works?" "The headache will ease first," she said. "Then your hands will stop feeling wrong." He looked at his hands. "My hands feel wrong?" "I know. You're tolerating it without saying anything, which is very on brand." Something shifted in his face that was close to an almost smile. "You always did read people too well. It made me good at the job." "Which job?" "Both of them," she said. She left him with Valdez monitoring and walked out of the ER into the main lobby corridor, which had changed in character in the last 40 minutes in a way that was becoming impossible to ignore. There were federal agents visible now, not attempting to be invisible, moving with the open purposefulness of an operation shifting from surveillance to active enforcement. Thorne was at the nurses' station, talking to 2 of his staff in the low tones of someone managing institutional reality while everything around it reorganized. The elevator opened and Brigadier General Marin Solis walked out. She was in civilian clothes, dark coat, no insignia, but carried herself with the specific bearing that clothing choices did not modify. She was 61, lean in the way of someone who had maintained physical discipline because the alternative was not acceptable, and she had a face that had arrived at its current expression through a long process of having been wrong about things and correcting herself. She was not alone. 3 individuals followed her, 2 in civilian clothes, one who Nora recognized as a JAG officer from the specific cut of the uniform partially visible under a coat. Solis crossed the lobby and stopped in front of Nora. For a moment, neither of them said anything. They had last been in the same physical space during a debrief that had ended Nora's military career. Not badly, not with ceremony, but with the quiet acknowledgement of someone who was done and needed a different life. Solis had accepted that without pressing, which had been the correct response and had cost Solis something, which Nora had understood at the time and understood better now. "You look like you've had a morning," Solis said. "I've had a morning," Nora agreed. "The soldier?" "Stabilized. Antidote is running. He'll need monitoring for the next 6 hours, but the trajectory is acceptable." Solis's jaw tightened slightly. "The compound protocol. I saw the field analysis." "Then you know what was in his morning lab draw?" "Yes." She said it with the weight of someone who had been carrying related knowledge for longer than this conversation. "Callaway, I need to tell you something before we walk into what comes next." Nora waited. "The Oren Group has been under DoD counterintelligence review for 14 months, Solis said. Not a medical review. A security review. The compounds they've been trialing and the Whitmore protocol weren't developed for commercial research purposes. They were developed as part of a classified research program that was defunded and officially terminated 4 years ago. Nora held very still. Officially terminated. Strand took the research private when the program was defunded. He took the compound data, 2 researchers, and the trial protocol, and he built the Oren group around it. He's been running the same trial on civilian and military patients that the government decided was too ethically compromised to continue. Solis paused. Some of the people who made that defunding decision are the same people who should have caught what Strand was doing afterward. They didn't catch it, or they didn't look. Is there a difference? Solis met her eyes. That's what the JAG review is going to determine. It landed the way large things landed when you'd been moving too fast to fully feel the smaller ones, with a kind of settled heaviness, the weight of the thing finally at rest. Nora had walked into Harlow County General 4 months ago looking for something quieter than her previous life. She had found, instead, the continuation of a story that had been running longer than she'd known and involved more people than she'd been positioned to see. "Strand," she said. "Where is he?" "We have him in a federal vehicle on premises," Reyes said, appearing at Nora's left. She had moved with the quiet efficiency Nora was beginning to recognize as her baseline. "Pruitt is in a separate vehicle. 2 members of the board who were in the conference room when we served the warrant are being held for questioning. And the physician who was running Suite 14? Dr. Carl Whitmore," Reyes said. "He's not on the premises. He wasn't on the premises this morning." She paused. "He hasn't been at this hospital in 6 weeks. His name is on the partnership, but Strand has been directing operations directly for the last month and a half." "Why?" "Because Whitmore tried to shut it down," Reyes said. 6 weeks ago. He walked out and we lost him. We didn't know where he'd gone. We got an anonymous tip 8 days ago that he was in contact with a federal attorney." Nora thought about that. "He's your informant." "He became our informant when he realized Strand was running a version of the protocol that Whitmore hadn't designed and didn't sanction," Reyes said. "The original Whitmore protocol had dose limits. Strand removed them. The shape of it shifted again. The way a picture that looked like one thing revealed itself as something larger when you stepped back far enough to see the frame. Whitmore hadn't been the architect of the harm, or not all of it. He had been the researcher whose work had been taken further than he'd intended by someone with different constraints. That did not make him innocent, but it made the picture more complicated than a single villain, which was how these things always were when you got close enough to see them clearly." "I want to talk to Strand," Nora said. Solis looked at her. "Why?" "Because the 31 names on the patient list include people who weren't military, civilian patients who had no connection to the DoD research program." She looked at Solis. "I want to know who selected them and how. Not for the investigation. Reyes has what she needs. I want to know because I've been treating those patients for 4 months, and their families don't know what was done to them." Solis was quiet for a moment. "All right. The federal vehicle was in this parking structure, level 1, the access that could be reached from the main lobby elevator. Nora rode down with Solis and Reyes and came out into the concrete cold. Strand was in the second vehicle. He was seated, wrists secured with the specific restraint protocol of a federal arrest, and he had the composed affect of someone who had been prepared for this possibility and had decided that composure was his best remaining option. Nora sat across from him in the vehicle's rear section. Solis stayed outside. Reyes was present, recorder running. Strand looked at Nora for a moment. "You're the nurse," he said. "I'm the nurse," she agreed. "I know your background," he said. "Solis's unit, combat medic, the Varnick operation." He said the last 2 words carefully, watching her face for reaction. "I know who you are." "Then you know I'm not going to be impressed by that." "I know you understand the research," he said, "medically. The compound we developed, the applications, in a controlled environment with proper dosing, it has legitimate potential. The government ended the program because of liability, not because the science was wrong. You administered a coagulopathy agent to a trauma patient at 5 times therapeutic dose," Nora said. "That's not a dosing variance. That's attempted murder. The dosing in this trial was calibrated to produce deaths that looked like natural progression," she said. "I know what it was calibrated to produce." He was quiet for a moment. The composed effect had a hairline fracture in it now. Not guilt, more like the frustration of someone who had believed their own framing for long enough that having it refused was genuinely disorienting. The civilian patients, she said. Gerald Austin, Delia Park, Arthur Bendel. How were they selected? Selection criteria were based on existing prognosis data. Terminal or near-terminal diagnosis, low probability of recovery. Patients who would die anyway, Nora said, so it wouldn't matter. Patients whose outcomes were already compromised. They had families, she said. Osteen has a daughter who calls the hospital every 2 days. Park has a husband who brings her lunch every Tuesday, even though she can't eat it. Bendel has a son who's been sleeping in the waiting room for 3 weeks. She watched his face. Did the selection criteria account for that? The hairline fracture widened. Not into remorse, she wasn't going to give him that, and she wasn't sure it was warranted, but into something that was at least the acknowledgement that the abstraction had human content. What do you need from me? He said. The full compound protocol for both agents, every variant, every dosage permutation you trialed. She held his gaze. I need it in a format that Reyes's medical team can use to develop treatment protocols for every patient who received either agent. That information is proprietary research. It was proprietary research, Reyes said from the front of the vehicle without turning around. It's now federal evidence. Providing it voluntarily affects how the cooperation is characterized. Strand looked at the back of Reyes's head. He looked at Nora. I want that on record, he said. It's on record, Reyes said. He talked for 47 minutes. Nora listened to everything and asked 8 questions, each one surgical. Not the questions of someone taking notes, but the questions of someone who already understood the architecture and needed the specific load-bearing details. The compound protocol was more complex than she had worked out from the field analysis, but not beyond her to follow, and by the end of the 47 minutes, she had what she needed to help Reyes's medical team build intervention protocols for every patient on the list. She got out of the vehicle and stood in the parking structure for a moment. The cold was the same, the concrete overhead. She could hear faintly the activity in the service bay on the other side of the wall. Vehicles, movement, the organized sound of an operation executing. Solis was leaning against the adjacent vehicle, hands in the pockets of her coat. You did well, Solis said. I did what needed doing. That's the same thing. Solis paused. There's going to be a formal process, testimony, your name on a lot of documents. She looked at her. I need to know you're prepared for that. I'm prepared. And after? What do you want after? It was a question Nora hadn't fully formed an answer to, because the morning had been entirely about what was in front of her, and there hadn't been room for what came after. She thought about the 4th-floor waiting room where Arthur Bendel's son had been sleeping. She thought about Lorraine at the intake desk, who had been at Harlow for 11 years and had seen the Whitmore consultations and flagged nothing because she hadn't had the information to know what she was seeing. She thought about the patients on floors 3 and 4 and 2 who were being treated by a hospital whose infrastructure had been compromised and whose staff deserved to know what they had been working inside. I want to finish what I started, she said. Solis nodded. All right. They walked back toward the elevator. In the parking structure behind them, the federal vehicle carrying Elliot Strand pulled out toward the exit, 2 agents in the front, a man in the back who had spent 11 years building something that could not be called anything other than what it was. In the ER 2 floors up, Merritt's blood pressure was climbing slowly toward acceptable, and Valdez was sitting with him in the way that good medical people sat with patients, not performing attentiveness but actually present. Thorne was at the nurse's station, talking to the staff in the low tones of someone beginning the conversation about what came next. Nora was halfway to the elevator when Reyes appeared from the service corridor, moving quickly enough that Nora stopped. What? She said. Reyes held out her phone. On the screen was a message from her field team, a document, photographed from hard copy, that had been found in Strand's briefcase during the vehicle's search. Nora read it. It was a patient list. Not the list of 31 she had found in the hospital's shared drive. A different list. Longer. At the top of the document was a header that read, Phase 3 Candidate Pool. Facilities pending activation. Below the header were names of hospitals, 4 of them in different states. And below each hospital name, a list of patients. The list for Harlow County General had 31 names on it. She already knew that. The other 3 hospitals had 46 names between them. She read through the names. She was two-thirds of the way down the third hospital's list when she stopped. The name was not Merritt. It was not anyone she'd treated. It was a name she knew from a different context entirely. A context that placed the person not as a patient but as a staff member, a nurse at one of the facilities on the list who had, as far as Nora knew, been living quietly in a different city and building the same kind of ordinary life that Nora had been trying to build in Harlow. A woman named Petra Voss, whom Nora had served with for 4 years, whom she had pulled from a vehicle in a situation she was not supposed to name. The hospital beside her name was Colson Medical Center in Kettering, Ohio. Below her name, in the same code notation as the others, was the marker Nora had learned to read over the last 4 months. She was on the list, not as a patient, as a candidate. And the activation date beside the Colson Medical Center heading was 2 weeks from today. She was already dialing before she finished reading the list. Petra Voss picked up on the third ring, which meant she was awake, which meant nothing yet except that she was alive and reachable, and Nora held on to that specific fact with both hands while the line connected. Callaway. Petra's voice had the slightly rough quality of someone who worked nights and had recently woken up. It's been a while. Are you at Colson Medical Center? A pause, short, but the kind that contained information. I started there 8 weeks ago. How did you... Listen to me. Don't go in for your next shift. The pause this time was longer. Petra Voss was not a woman who needed things explained twice, and she was not a woman who asked clarifying questions when the tone of a request made the urgency self-evident. She had spent 4 years in the same operational environment as Nora and had developed the same instinct for when a situation had moved past the point of normal procedure. How bad, she said. The hospital is on a list. Nora was aware of Reyes standing 3 feet away, listening. I can't give you the full picture right now, but federal agents are going to contact you in the next 20 minutes. Talk to them. Tell them everything about your intake process at Colson, any consulting groups that have been running through administrative channels, any patient records that seemed off to you. Nora. Petra's voice was precise and very awake now. Am I in danger? You're on a candidate list for a medical trial you didn't consent to. They haven't activated the Colson facility yet. You have time. Nora made herself slow down because fast was not the same as clear. You have time, but you need to move today. Understood, Petra said. No additional questions, no pushback, just the word, clean and immediate, and the sound of someone already moving on the other end of the line. Nora ended the call and handed the phone back to Reyes. Colson Medical Center, she said. I heard, Reyes said. She was already on her own phone, issuing instructions in the clipped shorthand of someone managing multiple threads simultaneously. We have a field team in Ohio. They can be at Colson within the hour. The other 2 facilities on the list, I'm coordinating now. Reyes moved away, the phone at her ear, 3 conversations happening in compressed parallel. Nora watched her for a moment, then turned toward the elevator. Solis was beside her. The list changes the scope, Solis said. The list changes everything, Nora said. This wasn't 4 hospitals. This was a rollout. Strand was building toward a phase 3, which means phases 1 and 2 already happened somewhere, in some form, and Harlow was the most developed node in a network that was designed to expand. She looked at Solis. How many facilities total? We don't know yet. But you knew about 3 of the 4 on this list. Solis was quiet for a beat that lasted exactly long enough to be an answer. 2 of them, Solis said. We knew about Harlow and 1 other, the Colson facility and the 4th one on that list. Reyes's team is running those down now. She met Nora's eyes without looking away from the weight of what she was saying. We should have moved faster. It was not an apology, exactly. It was something more uncomfortable than an apology. An admission from a person who did not make admissions easily, offered without the cushioning of institutional language or procedural justification. Nora recognized it for what it was and accepted it as such. We move now, she said. The elevator opened. They rode up in silence. The next 4 hours were the kind that didn't exist in memory as a sequence so much as a series of simultaneous pressures, each requiring a different kind of attention. Nora moved through them with the methodical focus of someone who had learned in a different context that the way you survived a situation with too many variables was to address one variable at a time and not let yourself see all of them at once. The immediate medical priority was the patient list. Reyes's medical team, working with the compound protocol Strand had provided and the treatment frameworks Nora had outlined, began systematic review of every patient on the Harlow list who was still in the hospital. Nora worked alongside them, not leading, because she was aware that her authority in this building was still technically suspended, and she did not want the medical interventions challenged on procedural grounds. She consulted. She answered questions. She identified 3 patients on the list whose charts showed the specific pattern of the secondary coagulation agent and flagged them for immediate intervention. 2 of them responded to treatment within the first 2 hours. The third was more complex, Gerald Austin, the first patient whose chart she had flagged 4 months ago, whose condition had been progressing longer than the others. He went to the ICU. His daughter arrived at 11 a.m. and sat in the family room on the 3rd floor, and Nora did not speak to her yet, because there was nothing adequate to say in the middle of it. Merritt's numbers continued to improve through the morning. The L-Trombopag was working, the PT-INR dropping in slow increments toward a range she could accept, the headache easing. He confirmed this without being asked, which meant it was significant. Valdez stayed on his monitoring with the kind of steady presence that good nurses maintained, not because they were told to, but because they understood what it meant to sit with someone in that particular kind of uncertainty. At 1:15 in the afternoon, Director Wallace Pruitt was formally placed under federal arrest in the main lobby of Harlow County General. Nora was in the 2nd floor corridor when it happened, and she did not go down to watch because watching was not something she needed. But she heard it. The lobby was visible from the 2nd floor overlook, and the sound traveled up. The absence of the usual lobby noise first, conversations stopping, phones not being answered, the particular quiet that fell over a public space when something outside the normal register was happening. Then the sound of formal language being spoken at a volume that carried, because the federal arrest protocol required it to carry, required the thing to be said out loud in a space where it could be heard. She heard Pruitt's name spoken twice. She heard the word charges. She heard the rest of it. Then the normal sound of the lobby resumed, differently. The same phones and conversations, but altered in texture. The way a room changed after something had happened in it that couldn't be unhappened. Thorne was at the nurse's station when she came back around. He looked like a man who had not slept and was not going to, and who had made a series of decisions that morning that he was going to be processing for a long time, and who understood that about himself. "Board is in emergency session," he said. "Real emergency session, not the one Pruitt called. They're talking about interim leadership." He paused. "They asked me to provide a statement about this morning." "What did you tell them?" "The truth," he said. He said it with the slightly stripped quality of someone who had told a truth that cost something, including that I was aware of the Whitmore partnership and did not ask the right questions. Nora looked at him. "That's going to complicate things for you," she said. "Probably," he said. Less than not saying it would have. He picked up a chart from the station. "Osteen's daughter is still upstairs." "I know." "She should hear something soon." "I know," Nora said. "I'll go." The family room on the 3rd floor was a space designed to be neutral, which made it feel like nothing. Beige walls, chairs with fabric that was meant to be comfortable and achieved inoffensive. A woman in her 40s sat near the window with a paper coffee cup she wasn't drinking from. She had her mother's coloring, Nora recognized. Gerald Austin had the same gray-green eyes, visible in the photographs his daughter had taped to his room wall 2 weeks ago. She looked up when Nora came in. "Are you one of his doctors?" she said. "I'm one of his nurses." Nora sat down across from her. "My name is Nora Callaway. I've been caring for your father on and off for several weeks." The woman's name was Lynn. Nora knew this from the chart family contact section. Lynn Osteen Marsh, emergency contact, relationship, daughter. "He's in the ICU," Lynn said. "They told me that, but they didn't tell me why it changed. Yesterday he wasn't great, but he was stable." "There was a medication issue," Nora said, because there was no version of this conversation that was easy, and the closest thing to merciful was clarity. A compound he received through a treatment channel that has since been suspended. We identified it this morning and we're treating it. His doctors in the ICU are working specifically on that, and the prognosis with treatment is better than it was 2 hours ago. Lynn held the coffee cup in both hands. "A medication issue. That means someone made a mistake?" Nora was quiet for a moment. "It means someone made a choice," she said. "And that choice is being addressed by federal authorities right now. and the people responsible are being held accountable. She met the woman's eyes. I know that doesn't fix this morning. I know it doesn't undo what happened to your father, but I want you to know that the people in that ICU are working on specifically the right thing, because we know exactly what was given to him and exactly how to counter it. Lynn looked at her for a long moment. You found it, she said. It wasn't a question. You figured out what was wrong with him. I had help, Nora said, but you started it. Nora didn't answer that directly, because the question of who started what was complicated in ways that the family room was not the right place to explain. Your father is in the right hands, she said. That's what I want you to hold on to right now. Lynn nodded. Her eyes were wet, but she didn't look away. And there was something in her face, the specific expression of someone who had been carrying alone the weight of not understanding what was happening and was now at least carrying something with a shape that settled. Thank you, Lynn said. Nora stayed for 12 more minutes. She didn't talk the whole time. Sometimes that was what the room needed. She came back down to find the hospital in a state of reorganization that was, in its own way, more unsettling than the crisis had been. Crisis had a focus. Reorganization was diffuse, people in corridors, having conversations that stopped when you passed, information moving through the building in the uncontrolled way it moved when institutional authority had been publicly disrupted and people were figuring out what the new structure was. 3 members of the nursing staff approached her separately during the afternoon with questions she couldn't fully answer yet, and she told them that honestly, which was not satisfying but was at least not compounding the dishonesty that had already done damage here. At 3:40 p.m., Reyes found her in the staff break room, where Nora had finally sat down with actual food for the first time since early morning. Ohio team has Colson Medical Center, Reyes said. They served the warrant 2 hours ago. The Whitmore protocol was in early stages there. 2 patients affected, both identified and receiving treatment. She sat down across from Nora. Petra Voss cooperated fully. She had already flagged 4 chart discrepancies in her first 6 weeks that nobody had acted on. Of course she had, Nora said. The 4th facility, Brentwood Regional in Nevada, was at the planning stage. No patients enrolled yet. They've secured the administrative leadership. Nora put down the sandwich she'd been eating and ran the count. So we have 6 patients at Harlow in active treatment, 2 at Colson, 31 on the candidate list here, and 46 across the other 3 facilities who would have been enrolled over the next 2 to 4 weeks. That's the number, Reyes said. If Strand had gotten to phase 3. He would have, Nora said. He was building the infrastructure. Harlow was the proof of concept. The others would have moved faster because he'd already worked out the problems here. Reyes was quiet for a moment. The DoD contractor angle is going to be a separate federal investigation. Strand's access credentials. We've identified the individual who maintained them after his consulting role ended. It's a mid-level administrator in the medical research office who received payments from the Oren Group over a 3-year period. She paused. Arrested this morning. Nora absorbed this without reaction, because the satisfaction of it was complicated by the fact that it represented a person who had been paid to keep a door open through which a great deal of harm had walked. The arithmetic of accountability rarely felt clean. Whitmore, she said. Carl Whitmore, the whistleblower. He came in voluntarily this morning, Reyes said. Federal protection. He's cooperating fully. His attorney has been in contact with the prosecution office. She paused. He's not going to walk away clean. He built the protocol. He ran the early trials. He knew what the compound was designed to do. But his cooperation is significant, and the fact that he stopped participating and reported it is factored in. What happened to the patients in his early trials? Reyes's face gave the answer before she spoke. We're still determining that. The records from the original DoD program were classified and are being declassified through the investigation. Some of those patients may have died in ways that were attributed to their existing conditions. She met Nora's eyes. We'll find out. It's going to take time. It should take time, Nora said. It should take as long as it takes to do it right. She finished eating in silence. Reyes stayed at the table, which was either company or surveillance and might have been both, and Nora found she didn't mind either. The formal debrief happened at 5 p.m. in a conference room on the 3rd floor, the same conference room where the board had been meeting that morning, which felt either ironic or appropriate depending on how you chose to read it. Nora sat across from 2 federal attorneys, Reyes, a representative from the hospital board, and Solis, who had positioned herself at the end of the table in a way that was clearly observational rather than participatory, but carried the weight of her rank regardless. The debrief lasted 2.5 hours. Nora went through everything in sequence, every chart she had reviewed, every access she had made, every decision and its rationale. She documented the overnight observations, the Whitmore partnership identification, the Suite 14 surveillance, the locker preparation, the re-entry, the compound identification and treatment sequence for Merritt, the billing records extraction, the confrontation with Strand's security officer, which she described with clinical accuracy and without editorializing, including the fact that she had used physical force in a situation where she had assessed it as necessary. The federal attorney on her left made a note during that section but did not interrupt. She described finding Petra's name on the list. She described the call. She described everything up to and including walking into the break room and eating a ham sandwich, which produced a brief silence before the attorney on her right made a note that might have been a laugh suppressed into professional notation. When she was done, the board representative, a woman named Hargrove, who had clearly been in emergency mode since morning and was running on a combination of institutional adrenaline and legal caution, looked at her across the table. "Ms. Callaway," she said, "I want to be very clear about something on behalf of the board. Your suspension this morning was issued under circumstances that we now understand to have been initiated by individuals whose authority has been fundamentally compromised. The suspension is rescinded, effective immediately." Nora nodded. "Additionally," Hargrove said, "your employment at Harlow County General is confirmed and in good standing, with whatever administrative corrections to your record are necessary." She paused. "And I think I speak for the board when I say that the phrase good standing is an understatement." "Thank you," Nora said. Solis, at the end of the table, said nothing, but she had the expression of someone who had watched an outcome that was correct, which was its own kind of statement. The room cleared in stages. Nora was the last to leave, which was not intentional. She stayed to answer a final question from one of the attorneys about the timeline of Merritt's intake, and she walked out into the third-floor corridor alone. It was 6:40 in the evening. The hospital had gone through an entire day around her. Shifts had turned, patients had been treated. The ordinary machinery of the place had continued because it had to, because sick people didn't stop being sick because the administration was under federal investigation. The third floor was quieter now, the administrative offices closed, the conference room dark. She stood in the corridor for a moment. There was a specific feeling she recognized from operational conclusions. Not relief exactly, because relief required that you had been afraid, and she had been too busy to be properly afraid until afterward. It was something more like the settling of weight into a shape you could actually hold. The dispersal of the specific tension that came from moving through danger with no margin for error. She felt it now. She let herself feel it, because that was the other thing she had learned in 6 years. The feelings didn't go anywhere by being ignored. They just took up space in a different room. She took the stairs down to the ER. Merritt's bay was quieter. The monitoring was still running, but the numbers had moved into a range that Valdez had marked as stable, with a noted improvement trajectory, which was the specific language of someone who had been watching carefully and was allowing themselves to be cautiously accurate about what they were seeing. His INR had dropped to 1.6. Not normal. Moving toward normal. He was awake. He had been awake for most of the day, which said something about his constitution that she already knew. "They're going to move me to a room," he said. "Tomorrow, probably. You're stable enough, but the monitoring should continue overnight." Valdez told me. He looked at her with the direct attention that was his baseline mode. "She also told me what happened today. The short version. There's a longer version." "I assumed." He was quiet for a moment. "The woman who brought the syringe, she's in federal custody?" "Yes." "And the physician, Strand?" "Also yes." He shifted slightly in the bed, which was the movement of someone who would have been sitting up straight if the IV setup had allowed it. "When I was being loaded onto the transport at the staging facility, there was a moment. The civilian team was doing the assessment and something felt wrong, but I couldn't isolate it. I was on pain management. I was coming off a field situation, and I told myself I was being paranoid." He paused. "I wasn't." "You weren't," she said. "I should have—" "Danny." She stopped him, not unkindly. You were injured and medicated and in a legitimate transfer situation with no reason to expect what you were walking into. That's not a failure of instinct. That's a situation designed specifically to look normal. You figured it out. I had 4 months of working inside it, she said. Different position. He accepted this with the specific kind of reluctant acknowledgement that people offered when they recognized the accuracy of a statement that didn't fully resolve the feeling behind the question. I'm being told, he said, that I owe you my life. Again. You don't owe me anything. We're from the same place. That's how it works. He looked at her for a moment. Callaway. Are you okay? It was the question nobody else had asked. Not because they didn't care, Thorne had checked in, Reyes had checked in, Solis had checked in, but because they had each been asking in their institutional capacity, in their professional register. Merritt was asking the way someone asked when they had been in enough bad situations with you to know that, okay, covered a lot of ground, and they wanted to know which part of it you were actually on. I don't know yet, she said. Ask me in a week. I'll be here for a week, he said. Then I'll answer in a week. She stayed for another 20 minutes. Then she went to find Valdez and went through the overnight monitoring protocol in enough detail that she was confident the night was covered, and she found Thorne at the station and told him the same things she'd told Hargrove and let him say whatever he needed to say, which took a while because Thorne was a man who had a lot to process and was doing it in real time, and that was human, and she didn't rush it. She signed out at 8:15 p.m. The parking lot was cold and mostly empty. She stood outside the main entrance for a moment with her bag over one shoulder and her jacket zipped, and the night air doing the thing cold air does to a face that has been inside under fluorescent lighting for 14 hours. Solis was leaning against a car 20 feet away, not Nora's car. She had been waiting. Nora walked over. You could have called, Nora said. I could have, Solis agreed. I wanted to ask you something in person. Nora waited. There's a role being created, Solis said. Joint DoD and federal medical oversight. The investigation is going to produce a set of vulnerabilities in military transfer protocols, in hospital administrative structures, in the way civilian and military medical systems interact. And someone is going to need to help design the response to those vulnerabilities. She paused. Not a desk role. Field adjacent. Going into facilities, reviewing systems, identifying what doesn't look right before it becomes what Harlow became. Nora looked at her. You're describing what I did for the last 4 months. I'm describing a version of it with authority and a salary that reflects the actual skill level involved. Solis held her gaze. You're the best person I've seen do this kind of work. The medical side and the other side. Both at once, without losing either. She paused. I'm not asking you to go back to what you were. I'm asking you to do something new with what you know. Nora looked out at the parking lot. A car was pulling in. A family, someone being picked up from a late visit. The patient in the back seat leaned against the window with the specific exhaustion of someone who had been in a hospital all day and was going home. She thought about the family room on the 3rd floor, and Lynn Osteen sitting with a coffee cup she wasn't drinking from. She thought about Valdez, who had stayed past her shift without being asked. She thought about Lorraine at the intake desk, 11 years at Harlow, who had flagged nothing because she hadn't had the information. She thought about 31 names on a list and 46 more at other facilities and the original DoD trial whose patient outcomes were still being determined. She thought about Petra Voss, 8 weeks at a hospital in Ohio, already noticing the things that didn't fit. Another person who had left a specific life and tried to build something quieter and had found instead that the skill set for noticing wrong things didn't have an off switch. Maybe that wasn't a flaw. Maybe that was just what some people were built for, and the question wasn't how to stop doing it, but what to aim it at. You said joint oversight, Nora said. Who else is at the table? Reyes's unit, a medical ethics board we're establishing specifically for this, and a patient advocacy component. We're still building that part. Solis paused. You could have a hand in designing that component if you wanted it. The patient advocacy piece. It's the part that's hardest to get right, Solis said. Everyone can design a security protocol. Almost nobody knows how to be in a room with Lynn Osteen and say the right thing. Nora looked at her. That's not a skill. That's just paying attention to people. Yes, Solis said, and you'd be surprised how rare it is. The parking lot was quiet now. The family's car had gone. In the building behind her, Harlow County General was running its night shift. Nurses doing rounds. the ER managing whatever came through the doors, Merritt's monitors tracking a steady improvement in a bay that was being watched by someone competent. The building was not fixed. What had happened inside it had not been undone by a day of arrests and federal warrants and compound antidotes. Gerald Osteen was in the ICU. The patients on the list at the other 3 facilities were being assessed tonight by people who were working as fast as they could. The full accounting of the original DoD trial would take months, and some of what they found would be things that couldn't be remedied, only documented and named, and not allowed to be unnamed again. That was how it worked. Not clean, not resolved into something that felt complete. Just known now in a way it hadn't been before. Visible in a way it hadn't been before. And the visibility was the beginning of the thing that came after. Nora looked at Solis. "I want final authority on any patient advocacy protocol we design," she said. "Not advisory authority. Final." "Done," Solis said. "And Valdez comes with me, if she wants to. She's the best pharmacist I've worked with, and she was the one who saw the coagulation numbers before I asked her to look. I'll make the offer." And Petra Voss gets the same offer. She flagged 4 discrepancies in 6 weeks in a facility she didn't even know was compromised. She's exactly who you need. Solis smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that didn't perform itself. "Anyone else?" Nora thought about it. "Not yet," she said. "Give me a week." She put her hand out. Solis took it, and they shook, which was an old-fashioned gesture that suited both of them. Nora drove home through the night streets of Harlow County, past the same intersections and storefronts she had been driving past for 4 months, which looked like themselves, and also like the backdrop of something she had been moving through without fully recognizing as the story it was. She parked in front of her apartment and sat in the car for a moment before going in. She thought about what she had wanted when she came to the city. She had wanted ordinary. She had wanted manageable. She had wanted to be someone without a particular history, doing work that had clear edges, going home at the end of shifts that ended. She had not gotten that. She had gotten 4 months of overnight shifts and chart discrepancies, and a conspiracy that reached further than a single hospital, and a day that would produce paperwork for the next 6 months, and a job offer that was the opposite of the ordinary she'd been chasing. And she thought, not without some irony, not without the specific tiredness of a person who had been wrong about what they needed, that maybe ordinary had never been the right target. Maybe the right target was something more like purposeful, which was a different word, a harder word, a word that didn't promise rest so much as direction. She had spent 6 years building a skill set she had then tried to set aside because setting it aside felt like healing. But the 4 months at Harlow had shown her something about that logic. The skill set wasn't the wound. The things that had made her good at what she did, the attention, the pattern recognition, the willingness to stay in a room with someone who was suffering and not look away, those were not the things that had hurt her. She had tried to put down the instrument because she'd confused it with the damage. She was done confusing that. Upstairs, her apartment was exactly as she'd left it at 6 a.m. A coffee cup in the sink, a jacket on the chair, the lined notebook on the table where she'd left it, when she thought the most important thing she needed was a secure channel and 30 minutes. She picked up the notebook, looked at the pages. All those careful notes, the meticulous documentation of a person paying attention in an environment that had decided she wasn't worth watching. She set it down. She was going to sleep for approximately 7 hours, and then she was going to go back into Harlow County General and check on Gerald Osteen and sit with Merritt for the time it took to properly answer his question, and then she was going to call Petra Voss with the kind of conversation that a parking lot phone call in crisis hadn't allowed for, and then she was going to start building something. Not a quiet life. Something better than that. Something that used all of her. In the morning, a story would appear on the regional news wire about the federal arrests at Harlow County General. Director Wallace Pruitt, charged with conspiracy to commit medical fraud and reckless endangerment, among other counts. Dr. Marcus Thorne would give a statement to hospital leadership in which he would be specific about what he had known and what he had failed to question, which would be uncomfortable and also necessary, and which would ultimately be the reason he kept his position, because institutions, when they were functioning, needed people who could do that. Elliot Strand would appear in federal court for his initial hearing and would look precisely the way people like him always looked in those moments, composed on the surface and fundamentally altered underneath. the expression of someone who had believed they were managing something that had turned out to be managing them. Lynn Osteen would call the hospital in the morning, and Nora would take the call and tell her that her father's numbers had improved through the night, which would be true. Gerald Osteen would not recover entirely. He was 61, and he had been through something that left marks, and recovery was not a complete restoration, but a process that took longer than the crisis did, and delivered something different than what you'd had before. He would go home in 3 weeks. He would have lunch with his daughter on a Tuesday and tell her, in the way of a man who did not say things like this easily, that he was glad she had kept calling. She would tell him she had been told to hold on and that she'd held on. These things would happen because enough people had paid attention, and because one person in particular had paid enough attention to tip the balance before the balance was lost entirely. That person would not tell the story of herself as a hero because she was not built for that framing, and also because the story of herself was not actually about herself. It was about what happened when people were invisible for the wrong reasons, when the assumption of incompetence was its own kind of weapon used against anyone who didn't fit the expected shape of authority. She had not walked into Harlow County General to fight that. She had walked in to be ordinary, but ordinary had not been what the moment required, and she was, in the end, someone who showed up for what the moment required. That was the truest thing she knew about herself, and she had spent 14 months trying to call it a liability. It was not a liability. It was, in the end, the only thing that had mattered. She turned off the light. Outside the window, Harlow County was quiet in the way of a place that had not yet learned what had happened inside it, and would learn in the morning, and would be different after that. Not fixed, not healed, just different. Aware. Which was where every real change had to start. In Bay 4 at Harlow County General, a soldier who had survived more than one situation that shouldn't have been survivable looked at the ceiling of a hospital room and thought about a woman he had served with years ago who had shown up in the middle of the worst day he'd had in a long time and done the impossible thing, which was to simply not give up. When giving up would have been the easier math. He had known people like that. They were never the loudest in the room. They were the ones still standing at the end of it, looking around at what needed doing next. He closed his eyes. The monitoring beeped its steady rhythm. Somewhere down the corridor, a nurse was doing rounds, and the hospital was doing what hospitals did at night, which was hold the line between one day and the next. The people who held that line deserved to know what they were walking into. Nora Callaway had made it her job to make sure they did. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything.